And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. They often say there are only two guarantees in life, death and taxes. Talking about the one that we actually have control over this morning, syndicated columnist John Hood joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. John, taxes, always a hot conversation, but especially with what we saw in the November election up in Washington, D.C., and the changes here in North Carolina. That's going to be a top button issue as we head into 2025. Tell us a little bit about your new piece over at carolinajournal.com.
Well, it is going to be a big issue. I wouldn't say it was really a big issue during the campaign. I mean, there was some reference to taxes by the presidential candidates, some of the congressional candidates. In North Carolina, the gubernatorial race really didn't center on tax policy. Some of the legislative races, it was mentioned, but not a big deal. That doesn't mean that it isn't going to be a big deal in Congress and in the state legislature in the next session in 2025. For example, at the congressional level, and I talk about this in the Carolina Journal column, we have a series of expirations. Those tax cuts that the first Trump administration worked out with then Republican Congress in 2017 will largely expire next year or shortly thereafter. And so the Congress is going to have to do something with it. Now that there appears to be a very narrow Republican majority in the U.S. House and a modest majority in the Senate, the Republicans will almost certainly extend or make permanent most of those tax changes. And that includes tax rate changes, including for personal income taxes. It also speaks to some of the ways that we levy taxes. For example, at the corporate level, do we allow people to write off over several years the investments they make in plant, equipment, other kinds of upfront costs that generate future income? Or do we allow them to immediately expense that? When we talk about it in terms of our private personal income tax returns, we don't have to depreciate all sorts of things over many years. Some things we do, but a lot of things we can just take it off immediately as a tax deduction. Businesses ought to be able to do that. Many of them have been able to do that since the 2017 tax law was passed. Some of that is going to go away, and there'll be a major push in Congress, which I assume the Trump administration will support, to make that, to at least extend that expensing or even make it permanent in the tax code, which I would certainly favor. Here in North Carolina, we don't necessarily have a knockdown, drag-out fight coming about tax policy in 2025, but it is very likely that the Republican legislature will continue its efforts that have been going on now for more than a decade to reform North Carolina's tax policies. Essentially, what North Carolina created is a flat tax. We have a flat rate income tax. It's currently 4.5%. The corporate tax is also a flat rate tax at 2.5%, but it's going to be phasing down under existing law to zero by the end of this decade, which I think, again, is a fantastic idea. I don't know if the legislature will attempt to speed that phase out up. I suspect not, because we've got a lot of other things that the legislature needs to worry about, like Hurricane Helene relief and things like that, that'll consume some of the fiscal headroom that you might otherwise use to do taxes.
Sure.
But there will be some tax changes. And some people in the legislature, some people in North Carolina say we shouldn't take that corporate tax all the way to zero. Instead, we ought to look at other taxes, like a North Carolina's franchise tax, which doesn't tax the income that companies earn. It taxes essentially their capital stock, how much they're worth. And some companies, particularly companies that have lots of infrastructure, like power companies and the like, they would prefer the franchise tax to be reduced or eliminated. But I think that just leave North Carolina's current baseline alone, which is going to be getting that corporate tax all the way to zero. Once we do that, and if everything else is held equal, North Carolina will have, according to the Tax Foundation, the fifth most competitive tax system in the nation. And it'll be the only such state, as far as I know, that has ever gotten rid of corporate income tax. A tax that should never have been created in the first place, and double taxes income, first when it comes to the company and then when it gets distributed to shareholders or in the form of wages to workers or whatever. So I think that that's a good policy we ought to stick to, and I talk about in the column why that is preferable to some of the other ideas people have advanced.
Well, and John, you bring all of this up and you talk about what's gone on in the last decade or so. There's so many new people that live in North Carolina and have moved to the state over the last 10 years. Can you just kind of briefly summarize prior to 2010 the state that North Carolina was in? Because if you've been here since 2015, things for the most part have been pretty good. You've seen your personal income tax decline, your business taxes decline. That has not always been the case here in the state of North Carolina.
No, before 2010, we had sometimes tax cuts, sometimes tax hikes. There was not a lot of stability in the tax system, and we had multiple rates. At one point, we had an 8.25% state income tax rate on top of the federal rate. That was crazy and unfair and counterproductive economically. So since 2010, the legislature has been steadily decreasing the tax burden and also reforming the tax burden, changing the way it's levied. I mean, in the sales tax area, for example, there had been a brief period where the Democratic controlled legislature had raised the sales tax. Republicans made sure that that sales tax hike went back down. But furthermore, the North Carolina legislature then expanded the scope of the sales tax to include more services. Why is that in the interest of taxpayers? Because if you expand the base of a tax, you can lower its rate. And it makes it fairer. If you're going to tax goods but not services, that makes the sales tax actually kind of a screwy tax. So if we're going to reduce the extent of that, then we needed to do what the legislature did. A good way to think about this from a tax reform perspective is that our income tax system, the base of that tax is too broad. It taxes all sorts of things like investment that really ought not to be in the tax base. On the other hand, the sales tax is too narrow. It applies to things you buy, but not necessarily to the services that you buy from people. And so we've got to keep expanding the sales tax base and shrinking the income tax base so we get to the right place, which is a tax system that raises the money we need, but does so in an economically prudent manner and doesn't pick and choose winners and losers.
We'll continue the conversation with John Hood coming up right after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on a Friday morning. We are tracking another recount, and no, it is not the North Carolina Supreme Court. This is House District 32, where Representative Frank Sossaman, who is the Republican incumbent currently serving in the General Assembly, he has requested a recount after losing to Democrat challenger Brian Cohn. Cohn leads Sossaman by fewer than 300 votes, and if this result were to change, the likelihood of that very low, but nevertheless, the recount process will be ongoing. If it were to somehow change and Sossaman was able to keep that seat, then the Republicans in the House would hold their supermajority, where they are currently one seat short. That is just one of the many races that we are keeping an eye on, including that highly contentious North Carolina Supreme Court race. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Continuing our conversation this morning with syndicated columnist John Hood on the Carolina Journal News Hour. John, there's often the alarm bells start ringing with individuals when you talk about cutting taxes, especially now with the devastation out in western North Carolina. You'll hear from some folks in the General Assembly that we can't keep cutting taxes, John. There's just not going to be enough money. We have to keep spending and spending and spending. What do you say in regards to some of those comments that are made by predominantly Democrat lawmakers up in Raleigh?
Well, I do think we need to take that objection seriously because there are important things that government does and it needs revenue to do it. That's why we have governments to perform certain to provide or fund certain public goods that we can't do privately. So, unless you're an anarchist, you want a tax system that will generate adequate revenue. So I think that's a serious objection. I just think that the General Assembly has handled that well. Instead of doing things breakneck speed, trying to do everything at once, we've tended to phase things in. We've had a formula to control spending growth over time so we don't end up cutting taxes and then praying that it'll somehow magically increase revenue and pay for government, which is not really going to happen. North Carolina has not done that, that we have not engaged in rosy scenarios. We've been pretty consistent and conservative in our estimates of revenue in the future so that we can, in fact, pay school teachers and police officers and pay for infrastructure, and in this case, rebuild the infrastructure in Western North Carolina. I think, again, Republicans in the legislature have been and should continue to take that issue seriously and make sure that their tax changes are consistent with delivering necessary goods and services. But the Democrats have a boy that cries wolf problem here. They have said for years that the state government will essentially collapse because it doesn't have enough revenue, and it doesn't really happen that way. And so while a version of this objection is to be taken seriously, the panic that we have seen for the last dozen years is unwarranted and has made their argument hard to accept.
In your piece, you talk about the changing not only of the legislature. The Republicans will have a supermajority in the Senate. They'll be one vote shy in the House. We've heard some conversations from Destin Hall, who's slated to be the new House Speaker, that for all intents and purposes, they have a working supermajority. But there's a brand new guy that's going to be in the governor's mansion. Roy Cooper termed out. Current Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein will be heading into that office coming up in parts of mid-January. How is that battle going to go down between Stein's fiscal policy and that of the Republicans in the GA?
I suspect that Stein will not be a dramatically different governor than the predecessor, one of his own patrons, Roy Cooper. But he will veto some bills, and the Republicans will have to override that veto. I think what Destin Hall is saying is on things like the budget bill, which is where most of our tax changes are going to happen, that it is likely there will be some Democratic votes in addition to Republican votes. And so they have at least a really good chance in the House of overcoming a gubernatorial veto. It may be other policies, other legislation, where the Republicans will fall a little bit short of having a veto-proof majority. And so it kind of depends on the issue. The one we're talking about today, which is fiscal policy, tax policy, that is the area the Republicans probably have the best chance of overriding a veto, as long as, again, they balance those budgets and they make sure that their tax changes are done in a way that does not endanger the core functions of state government. They've done that so far. That's why they've gotten Democratic votes for previous budgets by giving some of those Democrats some things to vote for in the budget. And I think they'll probably do that again.
We talked about this at the federal level and the statewide level, but this also goes on at the local level. And you talked about prior to 2010, hiking the tax rate, then cutting it, then having to hike it again because you're out of money. That happens a lot at the local level with property values skyrocketing, not only here in North Carolina, but countrywide over the last couple of years, essentially since the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020. I presume that this is going to be a big local issue in probably a vast majority of our 100 counties over the next 2-4 years as well.
Tax policy certainly matters at the local level too. What we've seen over the last, 15 years or so is that rural areas have become increasingly Republican in the way they vote, including for offices like county commission, and urban areas become increasingly Democratic. So there are urban counties like Wake County, like Mecklenburg County, that have in recent years increased their property taxes quite a bit, or at least not cut the tax rate enough to offset the rise in property values, as you say. And they haven't really paid an electoral price because Republicans aren't particularly competitive in those places. There are Democrats in rural areas that are upset. They want higher property taxes to fund schools or whatever, and the Republicans won't do it. So there is still this partisan divide often about property taxes in this case, or sales taxes, but there isn't as much of a political price to pay if, for example, you raise taxes if you are safe in a Democratic place. So it matters. There are still competitive places in North Carolina, places like Wilmington and Winston-Salem, where those urban counties have competitive elections for county commission. But a lot of other places, it's becoming more of an intra-party thing. Like in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, there are back and forth. There's lots of debate about tax rates and so forth, but it's usually, some of the Democrats wanting to go bigger and other Democrats saying, hey, that's too much. And so that's still an important tax policy debate that has political implications, but it isn't a strictly party line thing.
I want to go back to what you opened with as we round out the conversation this morning. You mentioned that the tax conversation was not super prominent at the presidential level, maybe little bits here and there throughout congressional races and a little bit in the General Assembly. Is it the issue that it's just not a popular issue to talk about when you're out electioneering? I think everybody, especially as we head into the new year, they'll be getting their 1099s, their W-2s from their employers, and begin the process of signing up for TurboTax and getting everything squared away before April. John, folks obviously care about taxes, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily talked about as prominent of an issue that it is.
Well, I don't know if this will surprise you or not, Nick, but I think the main reason why it's not as big a political topic as it used to be is because the tax reformers won. We have lower taxes in North Carolina than we did before. We have lower federal taxes for most people than we did before. And so the Democrats are scared of coming and saying, hey, let's do a big tax increase to pay for all these services. People don't like that anymore, if they ever did. So Democrats don't really make those kind of promises anymore. They talk about taxing the super wealthy, but I mean, there's not enough money there to really matter a whole lot in balancing the federal budget. So actually, the tax issue has been neutralized to some extent because the fiscal conservatives have won the debate. There just isn't enough of a constituency for tax increases for the Democrats to campaign on them, or any Republicans if they were to ever do that, like at the local level. And so it has been somewhat reduced as a voting issue. That is because the tax reformers have prevailed more often than not.
John, great insight this morning. Where can folks read more on your column and keep up to date with the other things that you're writing?
Well, the best thing to do, my column runs in lots of newspapers, but it always runs first at carolinajournal.com. So that's the place to find my take on North Carolina politics and public policy.
John Hood joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. As we sit and look at the results from the November election, Republicans will hold a slim majority in the United States House of Representatives, a bigger majority than most folks had even anticipated in the Senate. And of course, that brings forward the discussion about redistricting. David Larson, the opinion editor over at carolinajournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. David, you've got a new opinion piece out in the last couple of days talking about redistricting. That has been a very hot term here in North Carolina, and it actually played significantly into the Republicans' majority up in Washington, D.C. that we'll see come early next year.
Yes, thanks for having me, Nick. So looking at the U.S. House, I think a lot of people noticed that there were three pickups coming out of North Carolina, and if not for those three pickups for the Republicans, there would have been a different result. That it's going to be 220 to 215 with Republicans on top. But if you take three off that 220, you get to 217, and you add those three to the 215, Democrats would be up one, and they would have Hakeem Jeffries as the U.S. Speaker. So a lot of Dave Wasserman for the Cook Political Report noted that, and he said that if not for North Carolina redistricting, then Democrats would be on top. So that was kind of a common refrain, is that this is all due to Republicans not winning competitive districts and kind of on a red wave, but more just this one redistricting in North Carolina. But I in my article, I go on to talk about how maybe this isn't quite that simple. There's other states that also maybe have it's not as proportional as you get. 50-50 state has about 50 to 50 pretty evenly matched congressional delegations between the two parties.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's always kind of the conversation you'll hear from the left, especially if you're on social media, is that because North Carolina is a purple state, obviously unaffiliated voters are the largest, but Democrats and Republicans essentially the same. When you look at those statewide totals, that we should have 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. But if you look at the geography of the state, David, I mean, there's really not many blue areas. You've got those big thresholds in Wake and in and around Wake and Durham, the Raleigh area. Then you go down towards Mecklenburg County and Charlotte. You've got some of those crossroads there. But really everywhere else, it's for the most part pretty solid red outside of some other regional areas where things are leaning more purple. Is it even realistic to say that North Carolina should be a 50-50 or any state should be that based on this population breakdown, which happens, by the way, in most other states as well? Your rural areas are turning more red. Your more urban areas are turning more blue.
Exactly. And we had something, the Stevenson decision, where you have kind of a whole county provision where they're required when they're drawing these maps to try to keep in these districts they're drawing counties whole as much as they can. And really, Republicans won in 2010, so they had the opportunity to draw a map, at that point, and started getting lawsuits that these weren't fair. Whereas Democrats had pretty much drawn the maps for North Carolina before 2010, all the way back to the Civil War. But when finally Republicans got a chance to draw them, as you said, it's almost, they would have to try to draw something. They would have to draw crazy lines like the Democrats have been doing to create districts that would split things up pretty evenly, because 80 of the counties, of the 100 counties in North Carolina, Democrats aren't even competitive in. They're only competitive in a couple areas, and those are the areas they're very dominant, which are the Triad, Triangle, and Charlotte, as well as Buncombe and New Hanover and some of these other second-tier cities that they're at least competitive, if not dominant. But there's something that maybe they call like pizza-shaped districts, where they can take a little bit from the Democrat core and then spread it out and try to get enough of the rural areas to where they could have enough people for a district, but not so many that it would take it away from the Democrats. So, but that would have to be a very purposeful way to draw them. If you just draw them naturally with 80 of the counties Republican and 20 Democrat, and those 20 urban ones, and you try to keep the counties somewhat whole, you're going to come away with many more Republican counties. But another thing that I was pointing out, though, is in some of these other states, even though it's difficult to create Democrat seats, a lot of times they take that extra effort, like in California or Illinois, where they have a lock on the state houses. You have, for example, in California, it's 42 of the 51 congressional seats go to the Democrats and only 9 to the Republicans, even though they voted 60-40, which it's not particularly close. They won by 20 points. But if you were to take proportional, the 39% is what they got in California, Republicans got. That should get them 20 of the 51 seats, but they only got 9. So if people are complaining about those 3 seats in North Carolina making the difference, they could also look at, there should be 11 more Republican seats in California. Or if you look in Illinois or many of these other Democrat states, there's also areas that are not at all proportional. Illinois is actually a funny one to look at their what their map looks like, because there's these districts that they cover the entire state. And so there's 14 Democrat congressional seats in Illinois and only 3 Republican. And they actually voted, I think it was like 54-46. So it was actually much closer than one might think in Illinois. But even though it's 54-46 in the congressional generic vote for the state, Republicans only got 3 of the 17. So there's a lot of states, if people are going to look at gerrymandering, there's a lot of other states you could wonder, oh, is this where it made a difference? Rather than, people are looking at North Carolina as like, these 3 stolen seats is what made the difference. You could really look around the map and find a lot of other states that are drawn much more favorably to the party in power.
You had essentially 13 congressional districts this past election cycle that we knew what the results were going to be. Either the Republican or the Democrat was going to win. That leaves one, Congressional District 1, which is in the northeastern half of this state. That was essentially the only toss-up. You had Lori Buckout, the Republican, Don Davis, the Democrat incumbent. That was a very close race. However, David, the Democrat ended up being successful in his reelection up there. That was kind of seen, and I even saw earlier this week, Josh Stein was on ABC's This Week program talking about some of those electoral wins in a state like North Carolina that has elected Trump 3 times, continues to give Republicans majorities in the local North Carolina House and Senate, continues to elect, for the most part, Republican judges. they kind of see that as a shining example of, in these competitive races, Democrats may have the edge.
It's a very confusing state to people who are not from here, because I think there's a lot of places that just go straight down the line, that aren't as much ticket splitters. But North Carolina does have a history of where attorney generals, I think maybe only one attorney general has ever been elected that's been a Republican. There's been maybe two that have that were appointed, but I believe it's North Carolina, for whatever reason, governors and attorney generals are not chosen from Republicans. However, the president and U.S. senators are more frequently picked Republican. So I think some of that goes back to, a lot of southern states had conservative Democrats, and they when parties started reshifting, people started to split their tickets, and they would elect Republicans at the national level. And I think that tradition is kind of stuck too. As you said, Don Davis out in the rural Northeast, it's a heavily African American area, so that's one reason that it's been Democrat. Is African Americans obviously tend to vote more Democrat, but it's also a very rural area and a lot of military, and so it was a fairly close race. But Davis was also very strong. He's pretty conservative Democrat, and he was had a long history in the state Senate, and he was the incumbent. So I think he had the edge there. But that district is shifting gradually to more conservative. It just might take a couple more cycles.
We'll continue the conversation with David Larson coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on this Friday edition. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We talked about this earlier in the week, but the North Carolina General Assembly, specifically the Senate, unveiled a proposal earlier this week to cap the state's income tax at 5%. This would be coming through a constitutional amendment, meaning, well, you and I, voters of North Carolina, would have the opportunity to decide. Republicans argued that the cap would permanently protect taxpayers from future tax hikes, while Democrats expressed concerns over the state's future financial stability. Earlier this week, senators introduced a constitutional amendment that would reduce the current income tax, which is 7%, and roll that number back to 5%. The proposal did pass the Senate on Monday in a 30-19 party line vote and now awaits consideration in the House. They are back in session on Wednesday of this week, where not only will they be likely dealing with a veto override, but they will also be dealing with these constitutional amendments. They're back on the 11th, so that's next Wednesday. This move follows North Carolina's recent tax reductions, which lowered the flat individual income tax rate from 4.75% to 4.5% for 2024. Future reductions are planned to bring the rate to 3.99% by 2026. And while that rate remains below the constitutional cap, proponents of the amendment aim to safeguard future tax increases if the control of the General Assembly were to return to those that are in favor of higher taxes. And while that might not sound like something that is super practical or that is likely to happen, if you go back in the history books, 2006, 2007, 2008, North Carolina had an personal income tax rate of almost 8%, and yet with that huge increase, double of what some of these proposals are right now, the state was broke. Teachers and state employees were being furloughed. It was a really rough financial time for the state of North Carolina in the early 2000s, and Republicans in the General Assembly are asking the voters to agree to, again, move forward with this income tax rate cap at 5%. We'll see when that's coming to a ballot. We'll keep a close eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our conversation this morning with David Larson, the opinion editor over at carolinajournal.com, about redistricting and the effect that it had on the 2024 general election. Well, and I'm glad you brought up, I call these voters, these folks, ping pong voters. And it's evident if you look at the election results that we saw back in parts of early November. It's kind of a split in the case of the Council of State. You've got Republicans that won races and unseated Democrats. You have Democrats that unseated Republicans, yet it's about a split when you look at the Council of State. North Carolina, as you just mentioned, is a very peculiar political state. Is it fair to say that it's going to continue that way, or do you see a situation where one party really grabs complete and total control over the next couple of, in this case, it'll probably be decades, as the state continues to grow massively population-wise?
Your guess is as good as mine because the parties are actually losing affiliation while the unaffiliated is growing pretty rapidly. So Republicans are getting more people registering with them than the Democrats, but both of them are getting blown out of the water by unaffiliated voters. And these voters are showing that they're not particularly easy to, guess what they're going to do. And I think there's also a couple different realignments happening that will make it difficult to judge any kind of future, how people are going to be voting, because, there's a lot of conservative Democrats now that are, starting to wonder, I don't completely agree with my own party on a lot of things. Maybe sometimes I'll vote Republican. And then there's a lot of suburban and wealthy and educated, former Republicans that the Republicans used to rely on these like suburban wealthy voters that are now kind of becoming swing voters. So there's a number of different swing voters, and Hispanic voters are becoming swing voters. And there's a couple, fairly reliable blocks like college-educated single white women. They have very specific things like that are fairly easy to predict. But there's a lot of other demographics that are kind of looking at the field, and they might like this one candidate from this party and not like this one from this other party. You kind of saw that with Mark Robinson, and that Donald Trump, who has some similar characteristics and policies and all of that, he was able to win a big majority in North Carolina, and then Mark Robinson completely flopped. I mean, these are the same voters, so some of that is personality that they may or may not like, or a scandal, but I would say I don't have a great prediction for you for the future, because we're also getting a lot of people moving here, and many of them are coming from blue states, but they're also disaffected people. I often meet these people, and they might be the Republicans from those states, from a blue state. Like, in Western North Carolina, they have a big population, some people call halfbackers, people who retired down to Florida and then moved halfway back up because it was too hot in Florida. And they're New Yorkers and New Jersey, people from New Jersey and Connecticut, but they're often very Republican when I worked campaigns out in the western part of the state. So I don't think people can assume either that, a bunch of people from blue states are moving to North Carolina, that means we're going to get more blue. So that was a long rant to say there's a lot of unpredictable factors in motion right now.
David, you've got a lot more in your story, including some maps and some tweets and some various things. Where do folks find the latest details on that?
Yes. So I don't know, carolinajournal.com. We're trying to keep up with the election's over, but there's all kinds of analysis to be done, and also some recounts. So Jefferson Griffin is going to ask for another recount, it looks like. So if you want to stay up on kind of what the latest is with the elections, and as we move into the session, they can kind of stay up with all that there.
David Larson joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour.